Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today, I'll be talking about developer Yakov Butzoff's point-and-click narrative adventure, Loretta. Specifically, whether they managed to craft a tense thriller, or whether this femme fatale feature was a fiasco. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. The man had introduced himself as Chambers, said he was looking for her husband, that he owed some substantial debts to some significant people. Loretta, well, she couldn't help him. She hadn't seen him in some time. And given how large the countryside was, with its endless fields of wheat, the only thing she could do was wish Chambers good luck on his hunt. Now, as for whether she had any regrets about her husband's disappearance, the jury's still out. Now, I hate spoilers, a fair deal, which makes Loretta a bit difficult to talk about since the real meat of the experience is the game's story, providing the players with a legitimately interesting narrative to navigate. That said, given it tackles things in a rather interesting fashion, I at least want to talk a bit about the writing itself. See, I've tackled dialogue-heavy point-and-clicks before, and a reoccurring theme is that the strength of the writing can heavily impact how enjoyable the experience is. And I actually came away from this game feeling impressed because it does a solid job of embodying both thrillers and noir at large. In fact, the initial conversation you're thrust into does an absolutely stellar job at establishing the mood as you're tasked with dealing with an inquiring stranger you're given very little reason to trust, while playing a character who you can't help but feel isn't on the level either. It's honestly delightful, and the game does a great job at building up that tension and then maintaining it as the possibility of characters discovering our titular character's secret remains at the forefront, alongside the looming threat that she herself represents. Because as much as Loretta might try and frame things in such a way that she seems sympathetic, the truth of the matter is a lot more complicated, and her own role as a reliable narrator can be put into question, especially if you're paying sharp attention to the dialogue. And that's not going to be the only source of disquiet either, because if you pay really close attention to things or make certain choices, there's definitely moments where the game feels more like a horror game even. Especially when you cause the situations to go further off the rails. You can in fact divert the story entirely, exploring both literal and figurative dead ends and alternate paths, some of which drastically change the tone of the game for a time, and helping to add some degree of replayability to the narrative. That said, while you can explore the tangents that would cut the game short, you'll actually find yourself redirected onto the main route once they're resolved, which I suppose means I ought to address the process of actually making choices. While exploring around the areas can certainly help to clarify certain story elements, what actually directs the story down certain routes is mainly whether or not you indulge your base impulses and commit certain crimes, options that are helpfully highlighted in red just so you don't get accidentally murdery. There's actually a fair amount of permutations to be found over the course of the game, with 4 main endings and one which builds off another one, though that latter one requires you to be a bit more diligent. All in all, I actually had enough fun with it that I did 2 full playthroughs, both psychotically and also otherwise, with a little bit of finagling with the game's chapter selection options in order to change a few of my choices near the end, and to fiddle about and see some of the earlier permutations I'd missed. Which, yeah, okay, that sums up the narrative side of things. Insofar as the gameplay, there's nowhere near as much to address. Simply put, Loretta is a straightforward point-and-click adventure. Most of the chapter segments will hinge on you navigating a scene, engaging in some dialogue, and maybe interacting with an object or two. All of it feels pretty organic to do, and the puzzle solving doesn't tend to be too complex, since if you have the item needed for an interaction in your inventory, it'll be automatically used. In fact, the most challenging gameplay mechanic in the entire game is the segments which tend to herald the chapter, as you'll encounter some oddly artistic novel gameplay moments which don't really tell you how they function and just leave you to your own devices in order to figure them out. They're not too challenging, and failing them simply allows you to try again, so they're just interesting things to do which don't really slow down your momentum too much, but factor into the storytelling and the game's attempts at unsettling you. Oh, and there's also a very brief stealth sequence, but honestly, failing that wasn't that problematic. The game's very generous with its autosaves, despite its lack of manual saving. Still, that covers the gameplay, so that brings me to the visuals, and overall, I thought that Loretta provided a solid, stylish experience. It's a game that has some really nice detail to the world itself, with neat elements like the cinematic cuts it has for when characters are introduced into a scene. In fact, the detail given to those introductory portraits of the characters actually made the weird facelessness of them when normally seen in the world a little bit weirder. There's a lot of odd visual quirks here, really, and when paired up to how well fleshed out the world is, in the segment's preceding stages, it all just feels very intentional and very disconcerting, which is then further compounded when details you're used to disappear or certain other ones crop up. Admittedly, that's part of why I'm not as keen on the game's noir mode. While it's certainly interesting to have everything monochrome, and apparently makes the novel segments and the gameplay more difficult, I honestly found myself missing out on what had been there. I also actually have to give this game a lot of kudos insofar as the sound design, whether it's the call of a crow, the minute ticking of a clock, or the dreadful absence of anything. It's all done quite well, and this extends to the music as well and when it's used. It's just so complementary to the storytelling. And it's on that note, I suppose, that I should sum things up, because simply put, I think Loretta is quite good as a story. I will admit, if you're going into this looking for a challenging, cerebral point-and-click, you're probably going to wind up disappointed. Narratively, though, if you're looking for a cleverly told story that has some absolutely great pacing, a flawed but fundamentally interesting protagonist, and all the twists and turns you'd hope for from a good noir story, you'll be in for a treat. In fact, there were a number of details I got to appreciate on my second playthrough of the game that I'd missed on my first time round. Not just due to the wildly different way in which everything unfolded, or the weirdness I'd failed to engage with the first time around, but also because there were certain bits of foreshadowing that I'd missed. It's legitimately a solid enough experience that I would warrant dubbing this game a solid hit by virtue of its narrative strength alone and how it chooses to unfold that. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other member of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode. Take care till then, folks.